Hi.
Hi, welcome everyone to Research Quest Live. We're so excited to have you all here. And we're excited to be meeting with Dr. Mitchell Power, who is the Natural History Museum of Utah, curator of the Garrett Herbarium and associate professor at the University of Utah. So we're so excited to be talking with you today, and thanks for joining us again. This program today is part of our Research Quest Live series, which includes classes and question and answer sessions with experts daily. And we're excited to be here with you.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here too. I'm ready for some tough questions again.
Awesome. All right, well, I know we have already a bunch of questions lined up. For those of you that are joining us today and listening in, if you would like to submit a question, you can do that by visiting researchquestlive.org. And at researchquestlive.org, you will see our video streaming, as well as a box to the right side of the screen where it will have ask a question. You can go ahead and submit a question there. And if you're a student that's joining us, you can, of course, check with your parents, make sure it's okay to ask a question. And if you have any questions where you need technical assistance, you can also submit a question. Please include an email address so we can respond and make sure that all of our technical support is working as well. All right, my first question is really about what you do, Dr. Mitch. So why don't you go ahead and maybe tell us a little bit about what your role is at the University of Utah?
Sure. So I have a pretty lucky position at the university where I get to share my time in the Department of Geography and at the Natural History Museum. So my position is actually a split position. So I'm a professor in geography and I teach classes that focus on plant geography. So the distribution and locations of plants and why they grow where they do. And we talk a lot about climate and plant interactions in my classes. And so those are some of my geography classes. And then the other half, or probably more than half of my time, is up at the Natural History Museum, where I'm the curator of the plant collection. And so I help to take care of a collection. We have, I think it's close to 140,000 plants now. And so we have plants from all over the world. They are, if you've never seen a herbarium specimen, they're basically plants that have been collected in locations. Their location is written down along with the date and the collector and some information about the location. And then those plants get smashed and dried on a piece of, and then glued to a piece of paper, and then we store them. And so a lot of my job at the museum is making sure that this very large collection that dates back to the 1880s are some of our earliest samples we have. So making sure that large collection gets taken care of. And then, of course, as most professors and curators at the museum, I do a lot of research. And so I would say the majority of my time is doing research, studying forests and how forests change through time. I'm particularly interested in disturbance. I like to look at past disturbances, usually natural disturbances, so wildfires, for example, and then see how do forests change and adjust when these big disturbances come. So that's kind of in a nutshell, that's my role both at the department and at the museum.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's really helpful for our listeners to sort of understand your work. And so that way they can think of really, really great questions to ask you, right?
Right.
So we've had a student who's been joining us all week, actually. Her name is Elena. She's 14 in Layton, Utah. And she asked a question during our classes this week that we decided to save for you today. She was wondering, how can you tell how old a tree is?
Good question, Elena. So it's really hard, actually. And I've discovered after years of doing this, you can never assume you know when you first meet a tree. So trees will grow at different rates depending on how happy they are wherever they're growing. So you can take an example of a tree that's growing next to a river versus a tree that's growing high up on a dry slope. that tree high up on a dry slope could be really small and skinny in its trunk, but could be 3, 4, or 5 times as old as the one next to the river. So size doesn't actually help when you're trying to determine. It's more location. So if you can start to learn about locations and how some trees are really stressed where they grow and some trees are really happy, then you can have a better guess. But we use tree rings. And so we collect samples. We can drill into the tree with a tiny, it's called an increment core, but it just drills a little hole that doesn't hurt the tree. And then we can polish that piece of wood. It's called a wood core or tree core. In fact, I have one that I can show. So this, if I can hold it up to I don't even know if you can see the tiny little rings in that. So we can count each one of those rings is a year. So we can go back through time and we can count how many rings. Now, Elena, if you were to drill a core, say at 5 feet high in the tree, you're going to miss those first few years of the trees growing, right? So it's a bit tricky, and it's really hard to get a very precise age to say, oh, that tree must have started its life in 1782. Well, that's really hard to do. We can get close. We can get within a few years. And so typically we'll try to get an age of establishment, which means the tree was probably a few years old. But yeah, it's a challenge. We never quite know until we get back to the lab, put the trees under the microscope. It takes, and then even at that point, when we have a count, there's things in the tree ring record that can be called, they're missing rings. There are years when trees put on 2 rings. And so it's your certainty is never 100%. So good question.
All right. Yeah, that was a great question. Ryan and Elizabeth from San Jose, California have asked, what is your favorite part of being a scientist?
Oh, I think it's all the great people I get to work with. I love what I do, but I love it more when I'm surrounded by people that also love what they do. And so, at the museum, we just have such a wonderful staff and curatorial members that we just all love what we do. And so I think, the best part for me is it's not the topic or any particular research project. It's the excitement of the ideas and the energy you get when you work with people that are also excited in a particular subject area. And that subject area is quite vast. I mean, it's everything from how we learn, what are the processes of learning, to how do we do the science the most accurate and up to date, what we sometimes call what's the state of the art method to get the best science. So it's really, it's kind of finding your tribe, I guess, in many ways, right? It's finding people that love what you're interested in and you love what they're interested in. It's that collaborative spirit. I think that's so much fun about being a scientist.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's really, you had some things I can really relate to as well. That sounds like there's a lot to love about being a scientist.
Yeah.
So my next question, I'm not sure how easy it will be to answer, but Molly from American Fork, Utah was wondering, what was your favorite find? So have you ever, I guess, a plant or a discovery that you were really excited about?
There's a lot. I talked a little bit last time, a couple of weeks ago, I was asked a similar question. A very, very exciting thing that I've done recently is find this really old ponderosa pine tree. We think this ponderosa pine tree, which grows in the Wasatch Mountains of Utah, may be the oldest living ponderosa pine tree on the planet. And that's pretty cool. Like when you find something that is like, it's the oldest, or it's the biggest, or the tallest, or the largest diameter. So those kinds of things are just exciting. And so that's, in recent last couple of years, that's been a really exciting find, is, when you find something that's just a true treasure, and it's humbling, right? Like when I first started looking into this tree, we thought, oh, it's probably in line with the ages of older trees. But then, as we dug into it, and not literally, but we dug in with the research, and we started to discover this tree could be really, really old. So those kinds of discoveries just get you excited. It kind of, it validates what you do, and it just feeds the passion, I think, for doing this kind of work. So that recent one has really been a great excitement for me, that discovery of a very old ponderosa pine, which, so just to give you a context, the oldest ponderosa pine was in Utah, and it was dated around 900 years. And we think this one may be closer to 1,500 years. So it almost doubles the oldest age. So that's been pretty cool. But you know, there's so many things. It's hard to summarize in one, like what's the greatest, but that one has really been a fun scientific exploration. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, excellent. Now this next question, to be honest, I don't even think I would have even thought of it. It's a really clever question from Sylvan in Logan, Utah. Was wondering, have you named a new plant species? Or how do you name new plant species?
Yeah, so I haven't. And so it's an interesting question, Sylvan. So back in time, historically, as botany was growing as a profession, botanists would there was more plants to be named, right? So you could name plants after yourself. If you've ever seen like a Douglas fir tree, for example, that was named after this guy Douglas, right? And so a lot of trees and shrubs and grasses are named after people, but more recently that's slowed down. And so the latest trend, I would say, is that botanists like to name things after special people. So they don't as much name things after themselves anymore, but they'll name things after their mentors or their, one of their colleagues. So for instance, there was a new plant found a few years ago in Utah, and it's in the pea family. We call it an astragalus, right? But this pea was new to science, and one of my collection managers at the museum, who she passed away a few years ago, and she was part of the team that discovered this. So when Ann Kelsey passed away, we named this pea after Ann. And so it's really, what's really neat is, naming has become a tribute to some of the folks around us in the community who often are no longer part of the community. So that's kind of I think the latest trend, and really pretty neat to honor those who have invested their life in discovering plant species.
Wow, that's so cool. I think that probably many of the folks that are listening did not realize that, so that's super interesting. All right, Malcolm from San Diego is wondering, what is your favorite plant in the collections?
Ooh, I have a lot. I know it's probably no surprise. I really like pine trees because I think they get to be, they're around so long. They can live for hundreds, if not thousands of years. But there's one that I always go back to in the collection, and it's a little violet. And what's so neat about this little violet is that it looks like it's so imagine a squashed, pressed, dried plant glued to paper, because that's what it is, but it looks like it was collected yesterday. So it has all the colors in the petals, and the leaves are green, and it's just perfectly preserved. And this little violet, it's called Beckwith's violet. It was thought to be extinct in Salt Lake Valley. We know it still lives in other states in the West, and it's found throughout Utah, but not in Salt Lake Valley, mostly because of development. Well, this violet comes from a place in Salt Lake that is now, it's a park. It's called Sugar House Park. And the park, when the plant was collected, was a state penitentiary. So it was collected, I think, in about 1888 at the Utah State Penitentiary. And it looks like it was collected yesterday. And this violet has a lot of meaning because it's now very rare to find this in our own valley of Salt Lake. And so that's pretty special, this plant. And so you have to know a little bit about history when you read this location information. You say, oh, Utah State Penitentiary in the 1880s. So you have to find out where that was, and then you discover, oh, it's now a park in the middle of the city. And then, maybe the other reason I love that little violet so much is in the last several years, there's been small populations found in Salt Lake. So when we thought it was gone from the valley, it's now popping up. And I've had one of my grad students, Blake Wellard. Blake is, he's like a hound dog in botany. He just finds amazing things. And so he's found a couple of populations that are new to our knowledge that we thought were gone. So check out that little Beckwith's violet, and it's a pretty neat little flower.
Yeah, that sounds really great. And I definitely am going to look that up because I love, and you said it's purple, right? I love purple.
Yeah, it's purple and sometimes little splashes of yellow on it. And yeah, it's neat.
Yeah, sounds really lovely. Well, I think we're going to move on. We have lots more questions, but before we jump into more questions, I just wanted to take a second, encourage anyone who might be joining us on Facebook. If you would like to submit a question, you can visit researchquestlive.org. Ask a question there for Dr. Mitchell Power. He is the, totally losing my train of thought.
Long title.
Curator. He is the curator of the Garrett Herbarium and associate professor in the geography department at the University of Utah. This program today is part of Research Quest Live, which is part of our online series of classes and conversations with scientists ongoing every day, Monday through Friday, starting at 9:30 a.m. Mountain Daylight Time. We're having more classes next week, more conversations with scientists. We hope you continue to join us. If you want to learn more about the Research Quest Live classes and programs, you can visit the Natural History Museum of Utah's website. You can request to sign up for more information there or check out actually our class offerings there. All right, so Dr. Mitchell, I have lots of questions from students. I'm going to jump around a little bit on some of the questions that we've received, but Will from Pomona, California was wondering, what are the rarest trees? That's kind of an interesting question. And I'm not sure if they mean rarest to our area or.
Yeah. Good question. Well, you might have stumped me a bit here. I guess, if you consider rarest, which would be trees in their natural habitat, the thing that jumps to mind first are like the giant sequoia in California or the coast redwood along the coastline of Northern California. And they're not particularly rare because there's nursery stock and you can purchase the trees and people grow them in other places. But they're rare in that the amount of habitat left is very small. And so like the redwood, which is the tallest tree in the world. And I think I talked a little bit about the redwoods on a previous program. If you haven't visited the redwoods, you must do that sometime in your life. And the redwoods, I think, to my knowledge, are down to about 4% of their original range. So, the redwood coastal forest used to extend, up the coast of Oregon and down the California coast. And they really love the fog belt. You won't find them further inland than the extent of fog. And so they get a lot of their moisture from the fog belt. But because they're such a prized timber tree, and one tree can provide so much wood that they've been harvested, and it takes a long time for them to come back. So yeah, I'm not going to be able to answer your question, and maybe you can do a little online research and share that with me, because I don't know really. You might find some of the trees in other places like New Zealand or South America might be even more rare. But I of course go to our local forests, which those giant sequoias are quite restricted now, up in Kings Canyon and Sequoia National Park and in the Sierras, and the redwoods are really restricted. So I would say those are, in my mind, some of the more rare species.
Yeah, I think to follow up, thinking about some of these trees that live for a very, very long time, we did get a question from Amanda in North Carolina, is wondering, how is it that trees can live for so long? And I'll also add on to that, but how long do trees typically live? We have these trees that, have a potential to live for thousands of years, but I'm guessing that's not all types of trees.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and so it really depends on the stress, right? So it's different environments pose different levels of stress, and trees have different abilities to deal with stress. So one of my favorite trees is the bristlecone pine, which is one of the oldest living trees, and it only is found on mountaintops in the Great Basin and a little bit in the Rocky Mountains, and so it has this ability to survive, up at 12, 13,000 feet where it's so cold and it's so windy and it's so dry. But they have an ability to just buffer themselves against stress and grow very slowly. And so, it's really, it kind of depends on where they're occurring and, how they do it. Trees can be pretty resilient if they're given the space they need and the basic nutrients. So they need food, right? So providing they have the water and the nutrients, they can keep going. But just to give you an example, so lodgepole pine, which we talk a lot about in Research Quest, lodgepole pine is what we call a primary succession tree. So it comes in right after a disturbance. So it's really adapted to coming in disturbed soil and growing really quickly and establishing itself after a wildfire or even some kind of land clearing. It'll come in, but lodgepole pine doesn't live very long. It might live 60 years or 80 years. Occasionally you'll have lodgepole pine that can be a couple hundred years old, but because it's what we call a pioneer species, it's not programmed like a bristlecone to grow very slowly and tolerate a lot of stress and live for thousands of years. Its job is to come in and establish in a newly disturbed habitat, grow fast, and then put out a bunch of seeds and do it again. And so its life cycle is very short and kind of replicates itself, whereas some of like the bristlecones, that's not their strategy at all. Their strategy is, hey, if I can invest a lot of energy into establishing a seedling and keep that seedling alive, that could live for thousands of years. So really, it's a great question. It depends on the species. Different species have different strategies to kind of survive under stressful conditions. And I guess I'll just end with that question by saying, we have increased the amount of stress on trees. Humans have, and so by adding air pollutants to the atmosphere, that stresses trees. It can clog their pores and make it more difficult for them to photosynthesize and breathe. We've disturbed habitats. We sometimes cut off the flow of water by building roads, and so water can't move through the ground as easily. And so we've disrupted a lot of trees and their habitats through our activities. And so that adds another level of stress on how long a tree can live. So it's really kind of depends on the tree and their current situation. Yeah, it's a really good question. Yeah.
Yeah, that was an awesome question. And I learned a lot just now in your response. So super interesting. So one of the things you were discussing just now was sort of the strategy. So the structure and function of the tree, which relates to sort of its life cycle and strategy for survival. I think this next question also kind of fits into that same way of thinking. So Catherine from California was wondering, what are the advantages to having needles versus leaves? Or, why do some plants have needles and other plants have leaves? And what's that about?
That's a great question, Catherine. Imagine, those trees that have leaves, each year when they drop their leaves in the fall, and they have the ability to go into dormancy. And so, dormancy is a great strategy to deal with stress, right? Because as winter comes in the Northern Hemisphere, trees have to be able to deal with extreme cold. So many trees, we call the deciduous trees that have leaves, they, rather than doing what the pine trees and the conifer trees do, they get rid of their leaves and they go into this period called cold hardening. And so they toughen up, they try to get the moisture mostly out of their cells and put in like an antifreeze inside their cells so they don't burst when they freeze, because cells will explode if you freeze them full of water. So that's a strategy for the deciduous trees. They say, well, let's get rid of all these vulnerable leaves. Let's just go into a kind of period of hibernation, and we'll wait for spring temperatures to warm up. The conifer trees, like the pines and the spruces, and the cedar trees, they have a completely different strategy, and they don't shed their leaves, though they do lose needles over time. What they do is they produce lots of antifreeze. So they actually put antifreeze into their needles. And what's so neat that some of the scientists at the University of Utah have discovered is these trees continue to photosynthesize all the way through the winter. Even in pretty cold temperatures, they'll be pumping moisture up through their, I like to call it their plumbing, through their xylem and phloem cells. They pump moisture up into the trees and they're photosynthesizing. Now they're doing it at a really reduced rate. So it's barely detectable, but it's still happening. And then when spring comes, they don't have to have all of this energy to grow new leaves, because the deciduous trees, they have to take a tremendous amount of energy and refoliate, put on new leaves and get ready for the spring and summer months of growing and photosynthesizing. Pine trees don't need to do that. They're ready to go. They almost get a jump start on it. And they're able to actually, they're not growing per se in the winter, but they are having some basic metabolic functions happening. And so that's pretty neat. So yeah, they have different strategies. And like I like to compare like a bristlecone pine with, say, a ponderosa pine, where a ponderosa may drop a third of its needles each year. And it usually drops needles that are closer to the main trunk. And as it grows outward and the tips of the limbs get more needles, the inner branches lose their needles. Well, a bristlecone will hold needles for up to 30 years because they're living, on tops of the mountains where they're really stressed. They don't want to waste energy in needles and losing needles and building needles. So they're much more cautious with shedding needles. So again, it's different strategies for different trees, but yeah, they're pretty nifty at solving problems of stress. Yeah, good question.
Wow, yeah, that's so cool. 30 years, that's incredible.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have a lot more questions about trees and tree health, but before I think we get into some of those, I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about some of your research at the museum. Are there any research projects you're working on right now that you would like to talk about?
Yeah, so we're working on a project in the Uinta Mountains, and we're really interested in the role of wildfire. And so how often do wildfires happen in the past in the Uintas? We're interested in, when did lodgepole pine become established in the Uinta Mountains? Has lodgepole always been there, or is it a recent arrival? Because lodgepole has this really interesting relationship with fire. And those of you out there that have done some of the Research Quest investigations, you've probably learned about the lodgepole pine serotiny. And so the cones stay closed until a fire comes, and then the fire opens up the cones and releases seeds. And so we know fire is linked to lodgepole. So we wanted to study the history of lodgepole pine and wildfire in the Uintas. And what we discovered was that about 6,000 years ago, lodgepole pine arrived in the Uintas. And it was likely there at small population levels, but for some reason, 6,000 years ago, we have this expansion of lodgepole pine. And we think part of that was the climate became better for that species. But we also see when we studied evidence of fire, we see a significant increase in fire. So fire may have actually allowed lodgepole pine to come into the Uintas, and it also maintains lodgepole pine in the Uintas today. So it's interesting when you start to connect disturbance with trees. And so that's a project I've been doing for about 12 years now, in partnership with the National Forest, the Ashley National Forest. And it's really been neat to get to talk to some of the fire managers. And, some of the perspectives I've heard is that the fire managers have sometimes called the Uintas the asbestos forest. And the asbestos forest suggests, like, asbestos is fireproof, right? So their perspective is, well, the Uintas don't burn. It's too much rain in the summer and convective thunderstorms, and there's just not enough drought to really burn the forest. But that's a view of several decades of observation. And in my research, we're able to go back over hundreds and thousands of years, and using fossil pollen and fossil plant material and evidence of burnt plants, we can look at and say, well, actually over hundreds and thousands of years, fire has been a really important disturbance agent in the mountains. And it's something that probably won't go away. It just hasn't been so prevalent in the last few decades. So yeah, so those are some of the fun projects I get to do locally here in Utah. And it gets me up in the mountains and hiking around and trying to understand, when I walk into a forest, I always think, well, what did this forest look like hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago? And has it always had this same appearance? Or, when did these trees get here and how did they get here? And so those are some of the fun research questions I get to pursue.
Very cool. Well, Dr. Mitchell-Power, of course, we're so grateful to have you here and chatting with us today. We're about halfway through our time, so we still have lots of time for questions. If you are joining us via Facebook and you would like to ask a question, you can visit researchquestlive.org. Also, we were just discussing Research Quest Live classes. The Research Quest program is available both for live facilitation classes with museum educators or on demand, that you can go ahead and check out the program on your own as well. And the Research Quest program is designed for middle schoolers. It takes you on real world investigations. So this past week, we had classes studying the Uintas and looking at the phenomenon of lodgepole pine trees and how they're experiencing mass death there in the Uintas and thinking about the impacts on the ecosystem. So if you want to learn more about Research Quest and you want to sign up to receive information about our classes, you can visit the Natural History Museum of Utah's website. All right, so I am here with Dr. Mitchell-Power. He is the curator of the Garrett Herbarium and associate professor in the geography department at the University of Utah. We were just talking about using the past to help us understand the present. And we did get one question, and not sure if you have an answer about this, but I'll go ahead and ask it. So Olivia from West Jordan was wondering, what are the oldest fossilized flowers? I think she was also wondering, were flowers before trees or after trees, or like, do we see progression of evolution of plants the way we do with animals?
So it's Olivia, I think you said, tough question for me. So because those questions, which are really important questions, are what we call like deep time paleobotany questions. And so I work mostly, I call it a shallow history. So I work in the last 10,000 or 20,000 years, where some of my colleagues, they work in the last 100 million or 200 million years. But we know that the flowering plants, some of the first evidence of flowering plants come around 100, 130 million years ago. We get some really primitive plants showing up in the fossil record. And a lot of these are, imprints in rocks. And so when you find certain shale rock or other sedimentary rock deposits, you can find some of these fossil imprints of really ancient trees. And so we know they're, over 100 million years. But yeah, you're going to have to do some internet digging there. And maybe we can get a deep time paleobotanist on here who could really talk a lot more about this, because they're great questions. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was kind of an interesting question. I really appreciate Olivia's thinking that she's wondering these things, which are super fascinating to be curious about. Yeah, that's a great idea. Maybe we should look into that. See if we can get a paleobotanist to join us one day. Also from Olivia, we had another question. What can people do to save the lodgepole pines? And I think this really ties closely in with the research you were just discussing.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So, one thing I've done is I've looked at some of so we can build these models. And I think if you've done Research Quest, you've learned a little bit about building models. And so we can look at lodgepole pine today, where it grows, what conditions it prefers, and then we can put all that information into a model. And you can take a model and you can project the future. So I don't do this personally, but I have many colleagues that work in this. So there's some really interesting research outcomes from some of these modeling studies. And so we have this fancy term that we use. It's called the bioclimate envelope. So, imagine your mail envelope. And if you could take an envelope and then stuff all the lodgepole pines in an envelope, and then that envelope has to go to the best place to grow those trees. So that's kind of we call the bioclimate envelope. So we look at that. Where does lodgepole love to grow? And if we project into the future with what we know about how climate is changing and what the climate might be at the end of this century, we can see what happens to lodgepole pine. Now, you always have to remember with models, it's a working hypothesis. It's not reality. Things change, projections change, but it gives us an idea, and it gives us something to start to test against and run other models. And so with lodgepole pine, what we see in the models, it's kind of spatially, what's happening is lodgepole pine doesn't disappear. It changes its location. And so we see lodgepole pine disappearing from the northern part of its range. So in the Western US, that would be like up in Wyoming, Yellowstone, Western Montana, northern Utah. So we see a lot of lodgepole pine mortality at the end of the century from the changing climate, but we also see recruitment and expansion to the south. So it's really interesting when you look at these outputs. It's like, well, there's opportunities by the nature of change itself. The challenge for the trees will be, will those trees be able to go to where their conditions will be best? And there's different ideas around that. We as a human landscape that we've created barriers for plants and animals to move. So it's harder for dispersal, and dispersal is, how do seeds get there, and how do you establish new populations? So some of the ideas are, well, maybe we should look at these models and see where the best conditions will be in the future, and then start loading trucks of seedlings and juvenile plants and truck them there and start planting them now, and effectively getting ready for some of the loss we might see in some parts of the range, but also building communities and these diverse forests in other parts where they are predicted to want to grow in the future. So it's a tough answer to give you because we don't really know exactly. We can just use some of these interesting models, and we can put the best information we have in them to get a general idea of what we think. So I personally don't fear that we're going to lose lodgepole pine. I like to think of lodgepole pine as a kind of a weedy species. I said it's a pioneer species, so it's really good at just, you can run a plow truck through an area, or you can burn it, you can, have a windstorm, an ice storm, and lodgepole pine just pops back up. They love it. So they're pretty hardy, but if their growing conditions shift away from the Uintas, which is what we may see at the end of the century, then we've got to find places where they'll be able to do what they do today and support all the other species that like to live in lodgepole pine forest. So yeah, that's a great question.
Excellent. So I think our audience is pretty familiar with lodgepole pines, but I don't think we've mentioned yet the beetle infestation during our conversation today. So maybe you could talk about that a little bit. because during our classes, the students who've been part of our classes, we've received multiple questions about how long has the beetle infestation been happening? Phenomenon.
Yeah, so that's a really hard question to answer, because to answer that, we need to find fossil beetles, right? And we know that the beetles are native to this continent. They're not introduced from another continent. So we know they've been here. One of my colleagues in the Department of Geography, Dr. Andrea Brunel, so she's put a lot of effort into trying to answer this question. And some of her research up in Western Montana, she found just a few fragments of beetles, but they were, I think they're around 7,000 years old. So we know at least, 7,000 years, beetles have been around in the Western forest. And we can probably assume as long as the forests have been here, the beetles have been here. And so, the thing about the beetles is, there's over 600 species, I think, of beetles in North America. And there's just a few that are really the dominant pests that are killing lodgepole pines and some of the whitebark pines and ponderosa pines. And so we can assume those few species that are really the kind of outbreak species have been here for a long time. Probably, I would be confident to say thousands of years, and probably even, potentially 100,000 years. But to find that fossil evidence of beetles has become the real challenge. And one of the ways we do this is we go to lakes and we collect lake sediment records. So we take a core, we extract this tube of mud from the bottom of the lake, and we look for fossil plants and fossil beetles. And in that process, we thought, oh, let's find beetles in all these lakes. Well, if you ever get to visit an area that has an active beetle outbreak, go to a lake and look around the lakeshore, because what happens is the beetles float. They don't sink. So whereas the plant parts and the pollen and everything else is sinking and accumulating on the bottom as a record, we think the beetles are floating, and the wind pushes them down to the edge of the lake shore, and then they kind of dissolve and break apart on the edges of the lake. So we're trying to explore other ways, like how can we find a record of these beetles? So some of the latest ideas is maybe there's an associated community of other beetles, like the detritivores, that come up after the beetles. Or maybe there's a signal in the pollen from the trees that are being killed. You see a sudden drop in say, lodgepole pine, and there's no evidence of a fire. Maybe the beetles killed them. So we're trying to use other techniques. Maybe even it's a chemical signal. Maybe there's some pheromone in these ancient, sediments that we could use like a chemical signature. We really don't know. So it's an area, what's so exciting? It's one of these questions we don't have an answer to. We're trying to figure it out. And I hope that, we can recruit your help in the future trying to figure this one out. It's a good one.
Yeah, wow. I think at first glance, when you see that question, you don't realize how complicated it would be to actually try to answer that question. So yeah, that was a great question that student thought of. Well, let's talk a little bit more about you as a scientist and your background. Malcolm from San Diego is wondering what first got you interested in botany.
Good question, Malcolm. So part of my interest, I started, one of my first kind of research experiences was working as an archaeologist. And I did this on the coast of Maine. I was just coming out of high school, and I volunteered for a couple summers, and then I became a paid field archaeologist for a few summers. And I was having conversations with archaeologists, and they kept talking about why people were doing this and why people were doing that, and why did they live here, and why did they eat these things. And I kept thinking, the environment, it's got to be something about the environment. But I wanted to be able to measure something. And it was somebody on that team who was measuring the different plant, identifying and measuring the plant material coming from the site. And I thought, okay, humans are way too complicated. I'll never be able to figure out humans in the past. Like, it's just, we do things for complicated reasons. But I thought plants I can tackle, because plants are complicated too, and they're very tricky and nuanced, but I can say things with confidence around finding a fossil seed where I didn't have the confidence around finding a fossil arrowhead. And so it was partly my decision then to dive into botany, because I found this as a real kind of concrete way for me to ask questions about the past. And you can always, if you find a fossil seed, you can always say, all right, let me figure it out, and then I can learn everything that's known about the modern plant and try to use that to back up in time. And so really it was like thinking, it was that experience of thinking of the past and my personal frustration of like, humans are just too complex. What do I do? And then there was this window to discover botany and paleobotany. And so that really like drove me into botany. And once I started to learn, I mean, plants are like people, right? They have personalities, they're characters, they have these really wacky ways to adapt and live. And I just got really attracted to that. And it's kind of, haven't looked back since. So, yeah.
All right, great story. I think it's inspiring for the young people that are listening to sort of see the trajectory of how our interests might take us down different pathways as we progress in our careers. So I think that was super helpful. Also, we have some people, well, I should say Annette from Colorado specifically is wondering about how junior high students can get involved in science, the natural sciences, or maybe volunteer, or how can they get involved both with museums or maybe other organizations to help them as they develop their passion for natural sciences?
Yeah, Annette, that's a great question. And if you're, I don't know where you are in Colorado, if you're close to Denver, I mean, Denver has a great natural history museum. And even some of our colleagues that have worked here in Utah have moved over to the Denver Museum. So we have some strong ties there. So I would say, go to your natural history museums. You can go virtually online now and look at their summer programs. They offer often great summer camps. They will sometimes offer natural history walks, guided walks. And so you can get outside and start asking questions. And I would really, ask your parents to help you with this, but go in and explore opportunities through many of the museums in your neighborhoods. I think that's a great way. You can also, talk to your school administrators. I know in our high school, local high school and middle school systems, they're trying to develop programs that encourage kids to engage in scientific investigations. And so they do these smaller projects, they do stream restoration. They just did a program where they raised a bunch of game birds to be released out into the wild. So they had a bunch of chicks that they hatched and released them out. And so, really I would dig in at the local level and put the pressure on, school administrators, museum staff, and ask them, how do I get involved? Because persistence pays off, and you really don't take no for an answer and say, well, if they say, well, we don't have a program for junior high students right now, say, well, how can we make one? So look up those avenues and, reach out to us too at the NHMU. We have, incredibly talented educational staff who are networked all over the country and in all of the world for that matter. And our educational staff will have lots of ideas for you to dig deeper and find opportunities. So yeah, I would, press forward with that.
Yeah, I definitely second that. You can reach out to the Natural History Museum of Utah. We have multiple teen programs. And of course, we're excited to connect those that are not in our immediate area, but maybe connect you to some local resource in your area. And so I think that was some Great advice. And if you want to learn more, of course, about the Research Quest Live program, this conversation is just one program, part of this ongoing series. Every day we have classes and we have conversations with scientists and experts. You can visit the Natural History Museum of Utah's website, and you can find out more about Research Quest there or our other programs that you mentioned. We also, of course, we have naturalist walks and all kinds of programs if you want to learn more. All right, well, we have a little bit more time. We have 10 more minutes. So if you want to submit a question, go ahead and do that now. We're going to try to get to as many questions as we can. And I have a few more questions here. We've touched on this next one a little bit, but Felix was wondering, what are effective ways to kill or deter the pine beetles? I think it's, again, thinking about how can humans intervene to possibly help this ecosystem? And is that even necessary?
Yeah, good question, Felix. So the pine beetle is a tricky beast. So the pine beetle, the one thing that really fights against the pine beetle is cold winter temperatures. And so the colder our winters are, it's the more likely we have a natural regulation, because the pine beetles will always be here. They're a vital part of the system. They help kill old trees. Those trees provide habitat for lots of insects that come in and like to, the detritivores and decomposers. They come in and they like to eat up the decaying material. So pine, we don't really want to get rid of them. We want to reduce the impact they're having. And they're really having what we think is unprecedented, but of course we have a really hard time looking back in time at the pine beetle. So we can't really just get rid of it. There's one idea that maybe if we allowed some fires to burn more, it could kill off areas where pine beetles are living. That's an idea. There's, the other idea is that, pine beetles, they really have a preference for big old trees. For some reason, they don't like juveniles. We have a pretty good idea why, because big old trees have a lot of outer bark area, and it's that outer bark we call the cambium. It's like the juicy, tasty part for the pine beetles. And big trees have a lot of cambium. And so if you're a female bark beetle and you want to fly in and lay your eggs and make sure your eggs have lots of food, you're going to go for a really big tree. And the bark beetles actually have, they're like scouts, and they send out scouts, and these scouts find like the really big trees with all the juicy cambium, and they send out a chemical signal which says, hey, bark beetles, come on in, this place is great. And so then the rest of the bark beetles, not the rest, but hundreds come, and they start to attack the tree. So we're going to continue losing big old trees, but they don't really care so much about the juvenile trees. So another idea is, well, let's just plant or at least cultivate a more mixed forest. So we don't have a forest that's all the same age, and we don't have a forest that's all the same species. We have a forest of a lot of different species at a lot of different ages, and that will allow us to buffer against these really widespread outbreaks. And a lot of the big outbreaks happen because the forests, they're the same species and they're the same age. And so when all the trees are mature and they're all lodgepole pine, they all become vulnerable simultaneously. But if that forest had, juvenile and middle age and old age, then you wouldn't lose the entire forest. So those are some ideas, about trying to mitigate the kind of scale of the outbreaks. But the winter temperature, that's a bigger problem, and that's a global problem. And so really in the winter, you need a couple weeks of freezing temperatures to have mortality of bark beetles that are dormant in trees. And we're just not getting that in our winter times now. We're not getting that couple of weeks of extreme cold and freezing temperatures. So we're not getting winter mortality. So that's a problem that is much more complicated for us to fix that requires, really changing carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. And it doesn't seem, given, current trajectories, that we're going to deal with bark beetles through managing winter temperatures. Yeah, good question.
Yeah, some excellent things for us to think about and consider. I have a question that's not from students, from me. But earlier this week, we were meeting with some of the folks that helped us create Research Quest. And so we met with some of the producers and the filmmakers and script writers and folks like that. And we got to talk to them about their experience and what it was like to actually make Research Quest. And so I thought I would ask you, since you are one of the stars in the Research Quest program, and all the students have got to see you in the videos and hear your thoughts and get feedback from you as the lead scientist on the Uintas investigation. So yeah, what was it like for you being a part of creating Research Quest?
Well, it was a little scary, I have to admit, because when you're teaching in a classroom, which I do a lot, there's very rarely is there a camera in the classroom and a microphone. And so I thought, oh, it won't be so bad because we'll be out in the mountains of the Uintas, and I'll be in my natural habitat, right? And as soon as that camera came out and the microphone went on, I got really nervous and I got butterflies in my stomach. And then I watched Isabel like perfectly deliver all of her lines, and just, she was so natural and perfect out there. I thought, oh my gosh, she just set this really high bar, and now I have to like at least be as clear as Isabel was in her performance and delivery. So it was challenging to do that. But once you get into a rhythm, I think with most things, right? Once we had done several takes, and I got to know Cody and the Spy Hop team and all of the wonderful personnel working. It takes really a village. It was I don't know how many there were, maybe 8 or 10 of us out there. And people working on not makeup. We didn't really do makeup, but it's like, is your collar straight, and where's your position, and are you enunciating and speaking to the microphone? And so you have all these people attending to you. And at first it was like shock, like, oh my gosh, I feel so nervous and everybody's watching me and I'm going to say something silly. But after several takes, it started to feel okay, normalized. And I think working with Isabel was like, all right, if Isabel can do it, I can at least do half as good a job as Isabel. So she was really my guidance towards like normalizing having cameras in my face in the Uintas. So it was pretty neat. It was a unique, very unique experience for me. I really hope that in the next Research Quest programs, we get more youth involvement of students like Isabel and students like have participated today asking these questions. It's really to me the most exciting part is all of these kind of young minds exploring these environments and asking these questions. And so when I kind of put the whole picture together, it's bigger than my own nervousness. It's like, hey, how do we share this really cool information about these ecosystems and get people talking about it? And so once I kind of settled into the team and the dynamic of actually doing the interviews and videos, from there on, it just got really fun. And it was special to be part of that whole production.
Well, you did a really fantastic job.
Thank you.
So impressed. I can imagine now how it would be such a different format. And now in this online and distance learning world that we're living in, we're all kind of adjusting to these new formats, but we know, of course, it allows us to reach a much greater audience. And so that's the really fantastic thing about Research Quest, rather than an in-person class, because it is all available online anytime. And we're continuing to develop new investigations. Folks all over the country as well as the world have participated in Research Quest. And so we're so excited to share your research and research questions really with students all over the world. For those of you that would like to learn more about the Research Quest live program, please visit the Natural History Museum of Utah's website. As I've already mentioned, we have classes daily. Those are going to be continuing through the end of the month, 9:30 Mountain Daylight Time. So if you want to sign up to receive more information, you can visit the museum's website. If you just want to join, you know, we're, like I said, every day, Monday through Friday, 9:30 at the researchquestlive.org website. So you can just go there and at that time, and we'll have the instructions and the museum facilitator there helping you and providing instructions so that you can get started on your own investigation. Next week, we are going to be continuing our investigation in the Uintas, and we're going to be continuing to think about that whole ecosystem and how the ecosystem is changing and responding to some of the changes that are occurring, such as the lodgepole pines that have experienced a mass death. And so we really would love to have you back. If you know a middle schooler, of course, pass on the message. All ages are welcome. If you want to check out other programs from the Natural History Museum, of course, visit our website. We are excited to be sharing many new opportunities, especially in a digital format in the coming weeks. So please keep an eye out for that. And again, I want to thank our guest speaker, Dr. Mitchell Power, who is curator of the Garrett Herbarium and associate professor in the geography department. So thank you again.
Thank you. Great questions today. Keep them coming.
All right, and I'm going to go ahead now. I'm going to put up a feedback form if you have feedback on today's conversation, things that you would like to see other experts like a paleobotanist that was mentioned. You can submit feedback there. We're happy to review it and continue to make improvements on this program. And thanks everyone for joining us, and have a great day.